Hello, I'm Ed Wright, and this is a short piece about an audio-visual work that I composed in 2020. So if you're watching this in 2020, it's something fairly recent. If not, then it might not be. So it's common for composers to consider their work through a number of dimensions or axes. Examples of this can be found in fugal technique, Wishart's lattice model, for which then hopefully might be a picture appearing any moment, or more extremely with 12-note serialism with the works of people such as Schoenberg. This way of thinking lends itself to the invention of various compositional techniques. On a simple level, running variables in a kind of retrograde fashion, so backwards, through to the intricacies of things such as the art of fugue and Markov chain compositional techniques. This way of thinking is often kind of linear, looking at sets of pitches or rhythms and interrogating and manipulating a stream of data points effectively. So from there, it's only a small step to link extra information to this data. For instance, at a given time, a certain note could be played at a specified volume on a given instrument. You've only got to look at the works of people like Pierre Boulez for stuff like that. And thus, in computing terms, we arrive at a two-dimensional array of data, or something close to a square if you were to decide to tabulate it, perhaps. With the addition of other data relationships comes the opportunity to put higher dimensions within this array, popping an extra axis into a cube, followed by a tesseract, until such point as it's really hard to perceive as a listener what's going on with these individual different relationships. But what if, rather than looking at these individual data points, we're actually able, as composers, to look at the space and the dimensions of what's going on within the larger work? So, Precession, which is this piece that I've been working on, is an exploration of these ideas. So it draws on this pitch, timbre, volume, space that Wishart defines, that was a picture of earlier, but actually folds this square cube idea into the shape of a pyramid, so pulling the top corner or the top plane in. So working on that assumption that pitch is mapped to X and volume to Y and timbre to Z, notes can be placed anywhere within the body of that pyramid. That simple translation brings a lot of perturbation to what's going on within the system, as when any particular note or data point gets close to the top of the pyramid, it's really restricted in where it can be placed compared to X, Y values lower down within the space. Where this becomes really nice and interesting is being able to roll the pyramid like a die within a compositional space. If the viewpoint for the listener remains fixed with X for pitch, Y for and so on, any movement of the pyramid revoices what's actually going on notationally, potentially in quite strikingly different ways. So phrases can be re-articulated simply by rolling the die of this shape, causing constantly evolving transformations of the material. So the music is defined in a mathematical array comprising several lines of data. So we have X, Y, Z, milliseconds and play. X, Y, Z relates to the position of the note within the pyramid if the pyramid's not been rotated in any way. It also maps onto pitch, timbre, volume scales from 0 to 100. Milliseconds indicates at what point this particular thing happens through the piece. And play is either binary, 0 or 1, indicating if the event is a sounded note or a rest. It's possible to define a relatively subtle monophonic tune, and if you were to duplicate that process, it's easily repeatable to achieve the polyphonic capacity. So here you can see the first bit of that array. On the first bit we've got 50, 50, 50, 0, 1, showing 50 for X, Y and Z across the board, 0 in that it starts at 0 milliseconds through the piece, and 1 to show that it's a note. Moving on from that, what we can also now see is showing a notated version of that array. So it turns out that 50 maps onto the note A on the treble clef, and so on and so on. The pyramid shape is realised onto the screen, and the musical data is then worked visually as spheres within that and relative to that space. The spheres are then used to calculate what notes should be played based on their location within the fixed pitch, volume, timbre space of the observer, i.e. if the pyramid moves, the spheres move with it relative to the observer. So a repeated sphere located consistently on the apex of the pyramid would be voiced very differently as whilst it's on the same place on the pyramid of the triangle. It may well be changing a lot relative to the viewpoint of the listener. So the pyramid itself, the spheres and the tendon transformations are coded and realised using processing. This is done by building the pyramid very simply as a function and then reading through a note array to find the correct positions for the note spheres. This is then spatially shifted over time using a rotate function, but nested within this bit of code is another routine which then outputs the position of the sphere relative to the viewing perspective of the observer rather than based upon the coordinates within the pyramid. This data is then communicated via OSC to SuperCollider, where the sonification of the transformed musical data then takes place. And hopefully now you should actually see a little bit of the SuperCollider code for those that want to geek out. The instrumental voice uses subtractive synthesis to create shifts in timbre. The majority of the sound comes from band pass noise, with a band focused on the prescribed pitch and widening or narrowing depending on the timbre values applied. Pink noise was used for this, partly because it sounds funny and mainly due to the fact that it's approximately equally loud through the frequency range. So if you've got something very high up, it will sound roughly as loud as if you've got something that's filtered really low down and bassy. This was augmented by a sine tone tuned to the same frequency to reinforce the pitched element of the voice. Frequency is mapped from the linear data of the array into the exponential system of Hertz, with SuperCollider doing most of that work. This way, any data coming from the array between 0 and 100 can be used to control pitch, no matter which way up the pyramid is orientated and whether that would originally be looking at volume or timbre or any of those things. The amplitude of the envelope of the voice also changes to use the volume input, which makes sense. When the volume's louder, it's a higher amplitude, but this affects not only the overall loudness but also the attack onset of each note. Hence a louder note will have a sharper attack, and this is a subtlety which, when you combine it with reverb at the end of the signal path, goes some way to making it feel more like a real world sound or object rather than simply just something which is cooked up in a computer, which obviously it is, but it's nice to have something you can identify and latch onto. So given the nature of this work that's a kind of highly geometric, in terms of actually composing, my thoughts try to move towards creating something kind of fugal or serial or perhaps both. Neither of these work particularly well in context. The fugal stuff implied a sort of culture and sound world which didn't really fit with this sort of pyramid-y thing going on, and by the time you got through doing sort of 12-note serial things, it's very hard to actually understand what was going on at all. So experiments were conducted using raw frequency data, but often the outcomes were either really jarring or so close to being in tune to be quite annoying. So as a result, the 0 to 100 of the pyramid space maps onto a standard keyboard set of pitches, playing defined notes through the SuperCollider voice. So consequently, sort of created sort of simple, occasionally sort of atonal fragments that could be then repeated and reinterpreted as the pyramid rolled through the axis of the material, and that was developed. Once defined, you could develop it in a variety of ways, attempting to match some of this geometric sort of functionality of the visuals. So lots of augmentation, working with retrograde inversions and offsetting and granulation within the work going on there. Looking at individual data streams and in bulk, which hopefully built up something that halfway sounds decent. A lot of this composition, interestingly and somewhat boringly, was created using Excel, which is really dull and yet really cool because it makes crunching numbers really easy. So this might seem to be completely at odds with what you think of as doing like creative arting things, but it saves a lot of errors and it speeds things up and makes it a lot easier to run things, try things and go back to them and readjust them. What you can see now is a letter from Arnold Schoenberg, one of the great and the good of serial composition and mathematical composition in general, really, to a friend, Felix Grisel. And if your German is better than mine, then please feel free to comment below, regarding his violin concerto and a mistake in it. So, notation of the untransposed prime form of the row at its inversion at the lower fifth. Schoenberg states that Grisel will have to transpose and correct them for himself, since he, Schoenberg, had too much to do and is very tired. He also refers to the sketches to the concerto and wonders if it would be possible for him to check the whole work against the tone rows, since it's very difficult to identify them, noting that it might be possible later to print a list of errors. So, whilst Excel is not cool, it does help avoid things like this. So, Precession creates an array of material or notation set depending on whether you're coming at it from a mathematical computing background or music or whichever. But either way, it's basically ready to be processed by the transformations of this pyramid geometry. This presents two streams of creative input: the processing manipulations and the Excel note array, potentially three if the super collider voicing is included. So these systems are completely predictable, but given the complicated nature of their interactions, it's almost impossible for the composer to see like the nuances of what's going on. So as a result, composition became something of an iterative process, experimenting, developing things, setting up and auditioning systems, and then modifying and piecing them together, finding unexpected things that worked out in a cool way, keeping them, throwing out the stuff that really didn't work. So yeah, it's a very interesting and quite organic way of composing. So two key observations struck whilst doing this. Firstly, that time is a key parameter of this, but it really isn't looked at in any real way apart from a way of ordering things one after the other, which gave a lot of leeway for actually doing creative things rather than being locked in a purely deterministic system. Second was actually the nuts and bolts of it actually had surprising parallels with early 2000s sort of dance production, with the idea of sample stacking, where you could map strikingly different samples to very similar or the same notes on the keyboard, and by using different velocities go through them to create radically different sounds. Building from this work, it becomes apparent that while the axes of pitch, volume and timbre have been addressed, it's clear that time hasn't really. It'd be intriguing to kind of address that oversight if possible. In addition, there's a lot of spatial data within the material that could easily lend itself to multi-channel audio and sonification, which, if you're listening on a phone or in YouTube land, really doesn't make a lot of difference because it's probably mono or stereo at best. If you're looking at, say, concert hall, that sort of environment, it's not much of a stretch to go into surround sound, be that in more of a home cinema type setting, or indeed ambisonic type scenarios where you can actually have height as well working in there, which would seem a natural kind of quite good fit with what's going on with the rest of the piece. So that's all there embedded in the data anyway, really, and it'd be interesting to see whether that could actually be brought out, or indeed whether it's something that would have to be played around with, whether sort of one-to-one direct mapping would be interesting, or whether nudging or working with some sort of antitheses could potentially bring out more layers within the work. In addition to this, Precession is currently a fixed AV work. It'd be quite intriguing to expand this into a more performative experience. There are affordances within the programming language, such as the capacity to shuffle array data on a very basic level, so that it can be different each time you listen. But beyond this, it'd be quite interesting to play notes into the system in real time. You could use a simple MIDI controller to do that, so keyboard going in, and also potentially manipulate the orientation of the pyramid, or perhaps a combination of both of these. It could be very easy to set up a duet with one person playing notes in, another person playing the transformations of the pyramid. Looking beyond that, it would be quite intriguing to address the fact that that's really hard to do in a real-time situation. So coding, yes, if you're quick at coding and you can do things in a keyboard, you can kind of get close to doing decent three-dimensional things fairly quickly. A mouse is absolute rubbish, because it's essentially left, right, up, down. Things like Wii controllers are potentially an idea, although that feels like that's incredibly retro already. So perhaps one interesting way to look at that would be with the affordances of things such as virtual reality, whereby you could go in and physically manipulate the space, walk around it, observe it from different angles. So potentially there's a lot of space and a lot of leeway to go on developing this work. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to go and have a look at it as a piece of work, there is a link in the description below. I'm Wright. There's a lot more of my stuff on this channel, and indeed on my webpage at www.virtual440.com. Thank you very much for listening or watching, and goodbye.